Chapter 14. That night, Frances couldn't sleep. She'd gotten a new neighbor very early that morning around 3 a.m. Hadn't seen him yet. He stayed in his room. That was one of the perks of being allowed your own key. He hadn't come out for dinner. She hadn't seen anyone new come to line up at the dispensary for nighttime medications either. She'd gone back to her room after that and sat with her ear to the wall on the side of the room from which she'd heard orderlies introduce her new neighbor to his new facilities the night before. Being admitted at 3 a.m. in and of itself wasn't necessarily odd. Orderlies ran all sorts of tests on you when you first arrived at Fremont, checked your blood pressure, and reviewed your medications with you. That entire process could last late into the night if you'd been transferred in as something of an emergency, Frances supposed. At any rate, if patients misbehaved, they had to wait in holding cells till doctors could see them to calm them down, so maybe that had happened. No, what struck Frances as odd was not coming out of his room to eat it all. That was odd. Frances had struggled with anorexia over fears of malevolent poisoning. An orderly had followed her around for 3 months before she'd realized it wasn't poison they were using to keep an eye on her, it was the birds. The orderly had assigned her a point system from 1 to 10, scored daily, based on whether or not she achieved her goals of eating satisfactorily. And if she got less than 8, she was sent to talk to a special psychiatrist who tried to reason with her and increased her medication dosages. There had been no orderly outside her new neighbor's room to see why he wasn't eating. Now she listened quietly, scrunched against the wall. "Frances, what are you doing?" Damn, she should have closed the door. "I was just resting my head." "All right. You want to watch Cavalcade? They're showing it in the Commons room." No. "All right." That was the good thing about people thinking you were insane. You never had to justify yourself. You could say no and leave it at that. No politeness required. No subtlety. She could hear a faint breathing and grumbling on the other side of the wall, a strange, lilting accent when her new neighbor talked to himself, like he was cutting off the ends of words by swallowing them. Must be foreign or lower class, she thought to herself. Maybe that's why he wasn't eating, some sort of religion. She heard the familiar clanking of orderlies' keys that night around 4 a.m. Phones were ringing at the nurse's station. A gentle shushing murmur of orderlies checking up on one another from various units maintained monotony. "Yes, we've just had a... Oh, try down the hall." The tinkling set of keys had been inserted into the door to the room next to Frances. She rose, fully alert, darted to the wall between herself and her mysterious neighbor, and listened, heart pounding. "All right, sir, we are all ready to transfer you over." "Aha, transfer, typical." They always used that word. No, I won't go, I don't like it." "It's just routine counseling for group therapy." "Then fuck that. I know what this is all about, that shithead." "No, now, it's all right, Mr. Monado." "Fuck you. Your brother's waiting, it's purely routine. We're not going to do anything you don't want to." "Oh, Godfrey'll make sure everything's okay, won't he? Fucking Godfrey! It's all very painless, I promise. It's just talk therapy." "Yeah, and weaseling. Get your hands off me. Get off!" By now, most of the patients on the floor had woken up. Most simply sat, leaden-eyed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for sleep to reclaim them if it ever would. But a few, like Frances, stood and peered out into the corridor. They weren't allowed, for safety's sake, to unlock their doors until the orderly knocked on each at 7 a.m. the next morning. The safety precaution, explained every time they went over group protocols and community goal-sharing sessions, had been put in place precisely for instances like this, to keep patients from endangering one another. If patients didn't obey the requirements, their key-keeping privileges were revoked, but that wasn't why Frances didn't open her door, to look closer at what was happening. No, she was scared, to make herself stand out. Not now. She already knew. This was a cloning kidnapping. That was the only thing it could be. They were going to clone that man, Cockney accent and all. It'll all be very painless, just a group therapy session. That's what they always said. She'd heard them enough times to know. So she slunk back to her bed, to sit and play innocent, as she listened to the echoing twist and scud of her neighbor's footsteps, as the orderlies whose voices she never recognized trailed away with him down the hall. Chapter 15. The Sergeant Sanus sent to help Norman enforce his requested search warrant was a short, grubby man in his early 40s who was clearly not looking forward to aiding Norman. He actually sighed when they finally pulled up at Wesley Crown Hospital for psychiatric services. Norman led the way, from the car park, in to the nearest information desk. These facilities were set out almost exactly like Servway's more secure units, in that visitors were required to pass through 2 fail-safe checkpoints before being admitted to the sunnier, silent side of imposing concrete walls. The sergeant, whose name was Colin Hayes, let Norman do the talking, too. Norman was hoping to find out anything he could about the time both Robert and Rene had spent at Wesley. The original paperwork documenting Rene's transfer to Servways could also help clear up whether Rene had been lying about why he'd been transferred. Norman could request it as follow-up upon receiving Espinosa's documents. He just had to hope the ruse he'd set up would work. He approached the front desk. Hey, I'm here with a search warrant for medical records. The state is interested in procuring information on an individual suspected of drugs trafficking. The paperwork was handed over. Okay, you'll need to go to our systems manager for this. The systems manager tried to tell Norman it was too late in the day to procure the information he sought. It was only 3 p.m. If you come back tomorrow... No, it's a matter of urgency. Luckily, the paperwork reflected that. All right. The medical staff had been hoping to obtain legal advice before acquiescing to the search warrant's demands. The nebulous nature of asking after a patient without knowing their name seemed illegal. I mean, do you have anything concrete to go on? Yes. Norman directed the systems manager to page 3 of the search warrant, detailing probable cause. We know the man has been sent to the secure unit at Servway's protective facilities for assaulting a fellow inpatient over claims his uncle sent him a luggage ticket for a left luggage locker in West End train station. Collins was surprised. He hadn't realized Norman's search had such specific criteria to match. All right, this might take a while. I guess we'll need to cross-reference. Actually, searching medical records for patients who had been transferred to Servways took a matter of minutes. Norman and Colin received a type-out of the requested information at 6 p.m., at which point all Norman's carefully spun plans went out the window anyway. There were 2 men who matched the description of the drug runner Norman claimed he sought. Rene Cartesius, who had been transferred to Servways from Wesley 4.5 weeks prior, and Robert Espinoz, who had been transferred under similar circumstances 3 years before. Both intake forms clearly explained the patient in question was transferred after starting a fight regarding the fact other inmates didn't believe his uncle had sent him a luggage ticket for a locker in West End train station. What the? So they were fudging intake forms, somehow. Could such twinning have suggested cloning to Frances's mind if she were picking up on a related phenomenon at Fremont Lowell? How would she have accessed? So, how do we tell which is helping Patterson? Colin no longer found Norman's methodology all that impressive. It was a good question, or it would have been. Norman skimmed down the information available on both men. Both were blood type O, positive, height and weight practically identical. One had significantly higher blood pressure, but that wasn't much to go on. Had Rene simply cycled back through the system under another name, or was this some grand conspiracy by his uncle, whichever one kept sending him tickets to train station lockers, to keep him insane? It certainly was doing a number on Norman. Is there any way to prove these 2 men aren't identical? He asked the medical records attendant. The attendant had thought differing names would have been enough to go on. He studied the records. No, you're right, they do seem fairly similar. To keep Colin from becoming suspicious, Norman needed to keep acting like he was trying to track an inmate purportedly smuggling opiates out of Wesley's facilities. Unfortunately, it says here neither of these men were transferred back here to Wesley after their time in a secure unit. No. Damn, that meant they weren't in Wesley during the time Patterson had been on the run. The tip Norman claimed Dimitri had given him didn't add up. He had to pretend to be disappointed. In fact, he was astonished at his good fortune. If Rene had lied about why he'd entered Servways, it was a lie official records reflected, so either it wasn't a lie at all, or someone was tampering. His search for the non-existent drug runner at Wesley, though, had come to an end. The hospital's records as to where his so-called suspects were located now stopped with their transfer to Servways. Not bad, though. Collins left relatively pleased. We have the names now. We should be able to find them. Or him, if you're right, and it's the same person twice. We can at least ask if he's in any way involved. Maybe he's been involved in the drug runs before, and you were simply fed old information. Yes. I wonder, though. Norman hoped he hadn't landed this Espinoz fellow in trouble. He no longer resided at Wesley. He no longer fit the profile Norman told police to search for. But he knew better than to think they'd leave well enough alone. I'm just worried if my information source claimed the opiate smuggler was operating out of Wesley, and Espinoz isn't there, and Rene isn't there, maybe we're on a false lead again. Maybe that's how Patterson does it, feeds us false stories. Maybe your source of information is closer to Patterson than you realize. Ah, yes, good point. Norman had to walk a fine line here. He didn't want to bring suspicion down on Dimitri. Or maybe he just had the wrong facts at his disposal. Or just wanted to get me off his back. That's wasting police time. Not if I'm the one stupid enough to put the order through. Come on. They drove back to headquarters to report to Sanus. So, you think if he's housed in a different hospital, that automatically negates the lead? Well, where is Patterson operating out of? I mean, in general, have we managed to triangulate? His robbery was at Ludgate, that's all we have. We think he may have been seen up north near Rochester, but the evidence is sketchy. Luckily, both Ludgate and Rochester were very much in the opposite direction from Fremont Lowell, where Norman had last seen the man who could possibly be Robert Espinoz. If this identification was true, Patterson, in his theoretical drug runs, would be going far out of his way to transport drugs from Espinoz. So, hopefully, Norman could comfort himself in knowing charges against Espinoz could never stick. He hadn't just set an innocent man up. He'd honestly thought they'd find Espinosa with some alternative name for Rene somehow. It was still possible, they simply hadn't proved it yet. So, should we follow up? I've got nothing else to go on. Damn, now Norman was the one wasting police time, for the second time that week. Should he just tell them he had located Espinosa in Fremont Lowell? Did he know for sure the man he'd seen was Espinosa? It would be good to have confirmation. I'm just worried it's a wild goose chase, he admitted, downcast. What if I look into it on my own? No more wasting official police time. We can do that. I'll contract you out as a private detective. Norman's old degree in criminal justice qualified him to be a PI. I hope I'm onto something, he shook his head, relieved. Chapter 16. Walking into Servways with a search warrant felt like both Norman's worlds were colliding, but he told himself he was doing it for Rene. Really, this was simply going above and beyond in his duty as a visiting patients volunteer. Staff at Servways told Norman Robert Espinosa really had been transferred from Servways to Fremont Lowell about 2 years prior to Rene's arrival at Servways himself. Norman wondered if that transfer corresponded to the 7-9 project's intake paperwork in Espinosa's folder from the train station. Whereabouts inside Fremont Lowell was he transferred to? But of course, Norman already knew, really, from what patients and orderlies told him. Stepped-down patients, who had been allowed back to units with lower levels of security, were routinely housed in the residential units of whatever hospital had an opening, and indeed, that's where records showed Espinosa had been housed. There was no mention of a 7-9 project, so why would Espinosa have been put in rehab subsequently? There was no mention of substance abuse on either of the confidential medical records Norman had seen. He asked Wade as he was leaving, "Are there ever patients who come here with substance abuse problems that aren't caught, who then have to go into rehab after they've already been admitted?" Well, usually the withdrawal symptoms are pretty obvious, and if they were getting drugs from the inside. Maybe he had inadvertently stumbled upon a setup that actually did involve drug smuggling. Well, that would be a breach of almost every hospital regulation. Yeah, I know. You're saying you think that's been happening? No, I'm just trying to figure something out. He didn't want to tell Wade too much. You're coming back to see Vincent Friday, right? That's right. First, though, he had to keep his appointment with Francis. It was convenient. While he was at Fremont, he could ask to see Robert Espinosa in his new official capacity as PI for Glover County. He just wanted to ask a few questions, to try to see if this man was in fact Rene, just with a new identity. Scars could be painted over, he supposed, or faked to begin with if orderlies were bribed to pretend not to notice, and they were certainly a good way to fake the existence of two separate men when one wanted to disappear into a new identity. Then he could see whether Rene's uncle had shifted him to a comfier facility, or if the change in identity was related to some strange drug scheme. After all, why would they keep Espinosa in the rehabilitation unit otherwise? He'd already been in the psychiatric facilities system for months by now. He ought to have gone through withdrawal already. Frances, though, threw a wrench in his plans. As soon as Norman sat down, she started right in. "They cloned another patient while you were away." "Oh. But they haven't harmed you, right?" "Only because they knew you were coming back. Someone would miss me." "Your sister would miss you too, I'm sure. But she wouldn't be able to make the connection." "Have you talked to her about this, about what you're worried about?" "She'd tell the doctors." "Well, maybe that's a good idea. You haven't done that yet? You know how we were saying maybe you should tell the doctors." No, Norman. Now I know you're on my side. I know you half believe me, because you didn't tell the doctors either, or they would have come for me by now, up to my doses." It was true. He hadn't told Fremont's psychiatrists about her delusions. He felt guilty. He never liked to pressure patients into making admissions they didn't feel comfortable with, but it would be to Frances's benefit to be completely honest about what she was afraid of. Wouldn't it? He sighed. "What have you been up to?" She meant it as an attempt to understand why he hadn't betrayed her trust and told the doctors about her claims. "I've been trying to follow up on," he paused, "the patient I went to see in the rehabilitation center last time I was here. Rehab." "The cloning?" "Oh, yeah, Egbert's friend." "Right, close enough. It is just a rehab center, you know, for drugs." Hopefully that knowledge would enable Frances to feel at least slightly less nervous. "Tallies with what I've heard." "What do you mean?" "Well, that's what they always tell patients when they come to take them away. They're taking them to therapy." "That's not necessarily rehab." The way they kick up a scuffle it is." "So you think they may simply be in need of substance abuse assistance? Was this all drug-related?" No, that's just what they say to them to get them to come along." "Right. And you say another patient was taken in the same way, recently, at 4 a.m., on the dot, just this Monday." She had no way of knowing it had been 4 a.m. She didn't have a watch. But she would bet a great deal of money, had she bothered to look at the clock on the wall by the nurse's station, like she had many times before, that 4 a.m. had been the time she'd been woken. Who was he, the patient they took? What was he like? I never saw him. He never came out of his room. They just keep him here as a holding station in between sometimes, I suppose. At least, that's what I'm starting to think anyway. In between what? In between units. Ah, why here in particular? Because we're close to the cloning, the rehabilitation unit. Right. Shifting vocabulary was making it difficult for Norman to distinguish how much of Frances's delusion had grasped her mind today, and how strongly it had done so. So, the patient who left Monday, he was here for a week, or for how long? Only a day and a night. They took him out after that. He didn't even come out for dinner. Could this simply have been an auditory hallucination? Norman knew Frances did suffer from them. He had a funny accent, too. I won't go, I don't like it. She put on a full Cockney accent. I think he might have been foreign. They called him Mr. Monado. Norman blanched. What, did they say what he was in for? Group therapy sessions with his brother. At the rehabilitation unit? At the cloning. Yeah, they're gonna clone him, don't you think? Brother, clone, it's all a code. I'm telling you, I've been in this unit long enough, I know. But you've never seen one of the clones. I've never seen them together, but you can tell they're clones. How? Because they always come in pairs. You'll see. There'll be another Mr. Monado in a few weeks' time, only they won't call him Mr. Monado, but he'll sound exactly the same. And if he comes out, which they usually do, for food or to be weighed or something, he'll look exactly alike, only he won't be being called Mr. Monado, and they'll say he's a new patient just trying to fit in. That's what happened last time, fellow you saw through the fence, fellow you were looking at, who ate your paper. He came back through here twice? Sure. Once a few years ago, then again, right around the time you came snooping. Only stayed a night the second time. Like I say, it's a clearinghouse, and they'll be after me next if you don't sign up again. I will sign up again, of course. Can you ask to be transferred if you're feeling uncomfortable? Not on your life, too much fun. Frances grinned. She enjoyed this delusion. She'd be bored otherwise. A horrific stumbling block, but Norman supposed it was better than the alternative of suffering horribly from the illusions her mind produced. But are you frightened? Not with the safeguards in place. You're a safeguard, you know. Do you have other safeguards? I've got a new one. That Hugh Cosimer actor. You've seen him in Manhunt. He comes around sometimes. I know, he comes to Serveways too. Yeah, well, that's where I heard of him first. You can rent him out, you know. A friend of mine at Serveways did. Anyway, he's in the volunteer system, so I've finally gotten signed up to meet him. I told the nurse I needed someone else, on the outside, someone they can't make disappear. I'm seen with him, and then I disappear. People are bound to ask questions. They scrutinize the famous that way. I thought last time you said he was in on the cloning. Oh, everyone's in on the cloning. But this time he agreed to meet with you. Yeah, oh, of course, because I hinted to the nurse that, you know, I knew what was going on, so she put me on that list. Frances, if we're going by the logic of what you're telling me, and assuming the cloning is true, that doesn't sound safe at all, does it? Well, depending on who you trust. I've got it all worked out. I'll splash a drink all over him so the paparazzi take a picture. Then I'll have my picture in the paper, and I'll be noticed. Then people will ask, whatever happened to that lady who was out with Hugh Cosimer that day? They might even check up on me. So then, I've got a double-blind security going on. They can't get at me because I'll be too well known. Well, I'm glad you get to meet Hugh Cosimer. I know, I've been trying for months, but whoop, just drop a hint about the clones. I got that from you. I figured if you thought I was onto something, I must be onto something. So, whoop, just a hint about clones, and they scheduled me right in, right away. Frances. No. Could he do it? Further her delusion still more. An obligation to foster sanity vied with his own temptation to veer into believing a conspiracy he knew had to be half mad. But still, the fear presented itself that the last time he had seen Rene Cartesius, he had been getting in a car with Hugh Cosimer. But that was insane. Dmitri was right. He'd simply been listening to madness for too long. Cosimer wouldn't hurt Frances. He kept quiet. He needed to think. But Frances was very talkative today. She'd been bored lately and appreciated the distraction. I've even been eating more recently, so he'll take me out for a celebratory milkshake. Norman grinned. I'm so glad to hear that. Tell me, Mr. Monado, which direction did they take him? To the right, or... As he had last time, he pointed first in the direction of the door at the far end of the hallway, then towards the door that would lead out from the corridor of patients' rooms to the cafeteria. Same as always, Frances pointed towards the cafeteria. But that would be towards the rehabilitation center. Suddenly Norman wasn't as interested in interviewing Espinoz as he had been upon arrival. He wanted to find out what had happened to Wilhelm Monado. Chapter 17. Norman returned to Sanus the very same day, only Sanus didn't have time to see him. A deputy chief had been assigned to oversee his movements instead. I need another search warrant for medical records pertaining to Dr. Wilhelm Monado. Was he starting to believe his own conspiracy theories? What had started out as an excuse to use the old police systems he had become accustomed to was starting to turn, in his mind, into a justified hypothesis. Perhaps drugs were involved, if whatever operations Francis was picking up on were taking place within the rehabilitation unit. The search warrant was processed in about 3 hours, no questions asked. You think you're onto something, then? Yeah. You might need this. They deputized him for extra legal protection. Norman went back to Fremont the next day to request access to all files pertaining to Wilhelm Monado. He brought with him the folder of documents he'd retrieved from the luggage locker at West End. Perhaps Monado would have something to say about it. No, I'm sorry. We don't have anyone by that name staying here with us at the moment. I'll see if we ever... Was he discharged recently? The nurse clicked through her files. No, sir. I haven't got anyone in my files with that name for the last 8 months. That was how far the easily accessible admission files went back. Another mystery, then, smuggled in, flying under the radar, undocumented in official channels, just like Rene's luggage ticket. All right. It was too much of a coincidence that Francis's hallucinations should pronounce the name of a man Norman had only recently seen dragged into Fremont involuntarily. Moreover, the delay between when Francis claimed her neighbor had been taken away and when Norman had seen Monado first admitted suggested Francis may have been right. Her unit could be some sort of in-between storage area for those on their way between one unit and another. Norman went back to his car to get the notepad he traditionally brought to take notes on what patients said. He needed to review this, whatever might be going on, with Francis. On second thought, he'd show her the files on Robert Espinosa he'd retrieved from the luggage locker in West End as well. Maybe she'd have something to say about them. Then, he decided, after he had accumulated as much information from her as possible, he'd confront Espinosa himself. Was this man really Rene, under a new identity? His eyes latched onto the sight of Dimitri's spare lock-picking kit in the back seat. Almost on instinct, he tucked it in the front of his jacket. He was still wearing the contraption he and Dimitri had sewn together, doctored unnoticeably to be able to carry 3 times the normal amount in its pockets. He needed all the help he could get, if they were denying Wilhelm Monado had ever been to Fremont Hospital before. He'd seen the man enter. He arrived at the residential unit unannounced. Hi, I'd like to speak with Francis Hayworth, please. It's very important. Francis is in community forum right now. I'm afraid you'll have to wait. Norman waited. You wanted to see me? Francis pottered over. Yes. He waited until they were alone in the conference room again. Okay, now, try to tell me as much as possible what the process is you think is happening with that cloning. It takes place in the rehabilitation unit. No, below it in the basement. But, they house there, I guess. But, it's all connected. Right. Okay, so the basement. How do you know that? Because the lights are on down there sometimes, as late as 10 p.m. They say it's a special therapy group, and they always say it's a special therapy group when they come for people to clone, yeah? You don't need to be a genius to put 2 and 2 together. Oh, no. Of course there were going to be multiple different types of special therapy ongoing simultaneously in a psychiatric hospital. Norman didn't give up, though. When did they tell you those lights were a special therapy group? You mean, around 10:30 p.m., I guess. They took one of the patients once, when we were milling around for our socializing hour. We have an hour to watch movies after evening medications, and she was there. They came for her then. Yeah, for the special therapy. I thought you said you never got to interact, really, with anyone taken to the cloning special therapy. Usually I don't, but you're right, with this one I did. What was she like? You got a good look at her. Norman flipped through his notes. Do you know who she was? Where she transferred from, by any chance? Francis grew very quiet. Francis? She looked like me. How much like you? Enough. She was only here for a day. They let us hang out by ourselves. Then I screamed at them till they took her away. You never saw her again. No. And did anyone else see you 2 together? No, they put us in our own little conference room for a while, just so we could talk, get to know each other. She liked plants. Sounded pretty boring, aside from suspicions of cloning. And was there anyone... Oh, yeah, sure, there was an orderly part of the time. I'm sure they were always watching us. And do you know why they let you 2 stay off together in your own room? Some sort of special privilege? What did they say? They just said they thought we'd like one another. It was like they were testing us out. And she looked like you. Yeah, I thought so. Okay, thank you. I'll probably be right back. He still had to ask her if anything about Espinosa's paperwork rang any bells, fitted into any of the patterns she might have noticed. But first, he slipped out of the conference room with nothing but a hurried, preoccupied nod. He'd never heard of sequestering 2 patients off to one side before, just to make friends. Excuse me, Norman returned to the orderly at the entry to the residential unit. Can you explain a certain phenomenon one of my conversation volunteers has mentioned? They always tried to refer to patients participating in the conversational programs as volunteers themselves. After all, one didn't have to participate. Francis came to spy from the conference room's door. She'd never seen Norman so perfunctory. Even when she'd been housed at Serveways, retirement had already erased policing from his habits. Now, the authoritative attitude had returned in full. Do you ever pair people off together who seem like they might be a good match? Is there ever any sort of buddy system on this floor, maybe during one of the social hours? Yeah, sure, all the time, especially if someone's not feeling well that day. We might pair them with an orderly. No, this was a patient-patient pairing, in their own conference room. That can happen. We generally try to have everyone stick together in the commons room, of course, but yeah, I suppose, sit in your own corners, read. All right, thank you. Can you tell me, Frances Hayworth's schizoaffective disorder, does it include visual hallucinations as well as audio? The orderly didn't know whether he should view Norman as a visiting volunteer or a deputy. Did that information require a search warrant? Just off the record. I already received Frances's answer. I just want confirmation, before I base requesting a search warrant on the testimonial of a witness whose delusions may motivate her to bear false witness to her own disabilities. Oh, it's usually just audio. Is that what she told you? No visual hallucinations recently? None that have been marked enough she's complained about them. This would have been, any time within the last 3 months, I guess, or ever at all, while she's been here. There have been times when her delusions were acting up, where she has reported visual symptoms, yes. All right, thank you. Hopefully, that was all this unknown doppelganger had been, an innocuous patient colored identical to Frances by her own psyche. But Norman wanted to be sure now. Psychedelics could produce a similar effect. If administered without patients knowing they had been drugged, resulting visual hallucinations could be marked down as within the parameters of the patient's disorder. He'd suspected this place of padding suicide rates before now, for better funding. That sort of data manipulation was common enough, even well-meaning, as long as it didn't cover up a bona fide murder or disappearance. Could someone have been slipping psychedelics? I'd also like access to the basement levels for the unit across the way. He'd been escorted in to see Frances by an orderly before. He expected, as a deputy, someone would be available to escort him over to the basement he wanted to inspect. Which? The rehabilitation unit? Oh, I'm sorry, sir. Those basements are off limits for reasons of structural security. Structural security? Can you explain a bit what that means? There are no exits to existing car parks, so we refrain from allowing public admittance, as it could be a fire hazard. Great. That meant Norman really did have to go get another search warrant if he wanted to see the rehab basement.